A very warm welcome to Harris Manchester College and to this chapel, which is the only chapel in Oxford with a quotation from Voltaire in the stained glass. That tells you a little of our history. I'm sorry you can't see the Burne-Jones windows, but please come back in the daylight and see them. Welcome to the 2023 Upton Lecture, and a very particular welcome to our distinguished Upton lecturer, Professor Susan James. Charles Upton, in leaving a legacy in his will to found the Upton Lectures in Religion and Philosophy, asked that they be in memory of his two sisters, Martha, for religion lectures, and Jemima, for philosophy. That legacy was, alas, spent many years ago, and the last Upton lecture in that initial series was given in 1950. In refounding and relaunching the lectures, we are very grateful to Sekyra, a foundation fellow of this college and loyal supporter of our work here, whose generosity has made this year's lecture possible. Thank you very much, Ludic. I'm also very grateful to Professor Amir Srinivasan, Chichele Professor of Social and Political Theory, who kindly helped me think through the shape and content of these lectures as we were planning their relaunch. So thank you to Amir. Both Ludic and Amir are here tonight. Thank you. The writer and theologian Evelyn Underhill gave the very first set of Upton lectures in the academic year 1921 to 22, and in the process became the very first woman to give any lectures in theology in this university. The then principal, L.P. Jacks, wrote in his letter of invitation to her, "The lectureship, having been founded in memory of two women, it is thought appropriate to invite a woman to give the first lectures." This was in keeping with the radical tradition of our college, not only Voltaire in the stained glass, but also we were already co-educational by that time, and we had been co-educational since the college had arrived in Oxford in the 1890s, because in the 1870s, Francis Power Cobb and others stormed the philosopher James Martineau's lectures and said, "Let us in." And they did. So just over 100 years later, we are delighted that the first Jemima Upton lecture in our relaunch series is being given by one of today's most distinguished female philosophers, Professor Susan James. Professor James writes primarily about 17th and 18th century thinkers, but always, as the title of tonight's lecture suggests, brings the history of philosophy to bear on contemporary questions and problems. Her books include Spinoza on Learning to Live Together, 2020, Spinoza on Philosophy, Religion and Politics, 2014, Passion and Action, The Emotions in Early Modern Philosophy, 1997, along with a critical edition of Margaret Cavendish's writings and several edited volumes of essays. Professor James has taught at the University of Connecticut, the University of Cambridge, and Birkbeck in the University of London, where she's now Professor Emerita, and she's currently visiting professor at King's College London. She was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2019 and has received numerous research grants from distinguished institutions such as the British Academy and Leverhulme Foundation. She's also held visiting fellowships in a number of universities, including Australian National University, where I first met her in 2006, when we were both at the Humanities Research Centre. There I learned not only of Sue's brilliance as a philosopher, but also that she is a wonderful conversation partner and a deeply generous scholar. Sue, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening, and I invite you now to deliver your 2023 Upton Lecture on Fake News, Learning from Spinoza.
It's a very great honor to be re-inaugurating the Jemima Upton Lecture in Philosophy, and I'd like to thank the principal and the college very warmly for inviting me. It's also a special pleasure to be lecturing in a college for students who've decided to take a degree after they've done something else in life. Having taught for a very long while at Birkbeck College, that makes me feel at home. Now, as you know, This lecture is named after Jemima Upton, the sister of Professor Charles Upton, who taught philosophy here for over 25 years. During Upton's time, Spinoza, whose work I'm going to discuss today, would have been an important point of reference for his students. This is partly due to the influence of James Martineau, who was professor of mental and moral philosophy at this college, quite a title, and became the principal in 1869. Martineau included an extremely insightful study of Spinoza in his Types of Ethical Theory, but he was also Upton's philosophical mentor. In fact, one of Upton's main works was called A Survey of Dr. Martineau's Philosophy, and it contains a chapter on Martineau's analysis of Spinoza. That book was in turn favorably reviewed by an earlier Upton lecturer, the philosopher J.H. Muirhead, who had also studied at what was then Manchester College. I think Jemima Upton, who moved to Oxford around the time her brother took up his position here, must have heard an awful lot about Spinoza and probably had her own views about him. I wish we knew what they were. She's one of the many women whose voices we've lost, but at least we're still talking about her. So now to the lecture in her memory. In the last few years, there's been an explosion of interest in what we call fake news. As its name implies, fake news is usually regarded as a problem. It can be a political problem, for example, when it exacerbates conflict or undermines democratic institutions. It can be a moral problem, insofar as it involves lying and deceit, and it can also have serious legal and social consequences. But it also poses an epistemological problem. Fake news violates accepted norms of truth and truth-telling. In its extreme forms, it seems to cut the epistemological ground from beneath our feet by radically reinterpreting a state of affairs so that what would normally be regarded as evidence against a claim counts as evidence in its favor, or vice versa. But even in its less tyrannical forms, fake news unsettles our sense of why and when truthfulness matters. I don't think any of these problems can be completely separated from the others, but this evening I'm going to concentrate on the epistemological ones, and I'll say more about them in a minute. It's easy to assume, I think, that fake news is a recent phenomenon. And of course, in its current incarnations, it definitely has some unprecedented features. It can be spread bewilderingly fast on social media. It can piggyback on our addictive fascination with online images. Algorithms can be used to target likely audiences, and so on. But one of the things I want to suggest is that fake news is far from new. Others have rightly pointed out that people have been generating and spreading it for centuries. But what hasn't been so much noted, as far as I know, is that fake news has also been a topic of philosophical investigation. Within philosophy, there's a history of efforts to identify, explain, and criticize it. So what I also want to suggest is that by stepping back from our own attempts to theorize it, and exploring the ways past philosophers have approached it, we may be able to move our own thinking forward. With that goal in mind, I'm going to discuss one exceptionally systematic analysis of the character and causes of fake news, which is to be found in the work of the 17th century Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza. You may wonder what such a remote figure can possibly have to say to us about a problem exacerbated by social media, party political systems, vaccination programs, things he never dreamed of. But I hope to persuade you first that Spinoza offers insights into two of the most perplexing features of fake news, And secondly, that these have implications for the way we respond to it. While Spinoza can't yield detailed policy advice, well, that would be a bit much to expect, he does point us in a specific direction. Before I begin, let me say what I take fake news to be. As I'll discuss it here, it's got three main features. First, fake news claims are false or misleading, but they're accepted as true by at least some of the people who are exposed to them. To gain this degree of acceptance, they need to occur in a context that seems to validate them. People must have some grounds, however vague, for taking them to be true. So, although we tend to talk about fake news claims, I'm going to focus on what I'll call fake news narratives, which provide some sort of account not just of an event, but of how and why it occurred. For example, the claim that a state's presidential election was stolen gains any credibility it has from a surrounding narrative, perhaps about the machinations of corrupt state officials. Secondly, fake news narratives often contain outright lies or are deliberately misleading. When the tobacco industry tried to tip the balance of opinion in favor of smoking by publicizing the small number of scientific articles which argued that smoking doesn't damage health, it deliberately set out to mislead health professionals. It embedded the claim that smoking isn't dangerous in a narrative that lent it an air of truth. In many cases, it seems clear that agents like the tobacco companies deliberately propagate false or misleading narratives for self-interested reasons, such as keeping up profits or hanging on to political power. But coming now to the third feature of fake news, there also seem to be psychologically more complex cases where people don't exactly lie or deceive, but are just relatively unconcerned about whether the claims they make are true. Epistemologists tend to describe these as cases of what Harry Frankfurt called bullshit, being indifferent to whether what you say is true or whether it's likely to be taken as true. Whether or not it's right to characterize it in this way, it does seem that fake news narratives flourish in conditions where people who propagate and accept them have a relatively weak commitment to truth in domains where we would expect it to be stronger. So we're not dealing here with practices like fiction writing, where truth is agreed to be at a discount, but with things like news reporting or public policy decisions. Given all the evidence, for example, we'd expect people to stop claiming that the US presidential election was stolen, but a good many of them don't. Understanding this phenomenon is, I think, one of the most interesting problems that fake news poses, and with Spinoza's help, it's the one I'm going to explore. Now, if the three characteristics I've outlined are the central features of fake news, then early modern societies knew it very well. As they encountered it, fake news flourished within the religious disputes that divided many European states, including the United Provinces of the Netherlands, where Spinoza spent his life. He's just one of many early modern writers who criticized religious officials, in his case, the preachers of the Dutch Reformed Church, for propagating superstition. And superstition, as he portrays it, is a form of fake news. First, the preachers propagate falsehoods. Rather than helping their congregations discern the ancient principles of true religion, they propound, he says, newfangled mysteries that defy explanation. For example, by describing ordinary natural events as miracles. They also deliberately mislead their audiences for their own ends. Under the guise of teaching religion, what they're really doing, Spinoza says, is trying to secure their own popularity. The church has become a theater full of orators, where, in the struggle to strengthen their reputation and extend their influence, preachers resort to narratives that they know to be misleading or false. Desperate to uphold their positions, they cling to their doctrines and viciously attack their opponents. Finally, and to Spinoza's mind most damagingly, these purveyors of superstition both exemplify and encourage the relatively slack commitment to truth that's such a striking feature of fake news. As well as cajoling their followers into accepting narratives that are misleading, they inculcate a range of attitudes that weaken their listeners' confidence in their own critical powers and undermine their ability to use them. The preachers condemn reasoning as impiety on the grounds that the intellect is naturally corrupt. Anyone who raises rational objections is dismissed as proud and overconfident. The preachers also encourage credulity. Accepting their teachings blindly is rewarded as a mark of faith. And they identify obstinacy with constancy. Stubbornly refusing to change one's mind or alter one's attitudes is taken as evidence of one's unshakable devotion to religion. So by imposing a distorting and punitive epistemological regime, the preachers inculcate epistemological weaknesses under the guise of virtues, much in the way that some contemporary propagators of fake news discredit inconvenient evidence by arguing that it's been planted by their opponents and is part of a conspiracy against them. The preachers insulate their narratives from criticism. Even thinking about this state of affairs makes Spinoza furious. Superstition, he protests, destroys our humanity. It turns us from rational beings into beasts, he says, and subordinates us to hypocritical authorities. However, as he also points out at many calmer moments, it's useless to rail against it. Instead of complaining about these forms of fake news, we need to understand them, to consider how they come about and what allows them to flourish. Rather than treating them as pathological or abnormal, we need to approach them as natural manifestations of the overarching set of dispositions that gives rise to all our thoughts and actions. In Spinoza's words, whether someone is wise or ignorant, they're part of nature, and whatever determines them to act must be referred to the power of nature. So what natural features of human beings do explain why people are susceptible to the misleading narratives the preachers offer and to the destructive epistemological strategies they contain? And what natural dispositions might explain the preacher's willingness to lie and deceive? What is it about our nature that sometimes makes us susceptible to fake news? To appreciate Spinoza's answer, we need to start from one of his deepest philosophical commitments, that the essence of human beings is what he calls their conatus, or their striving to persevere in their being. As humans, we invariably and unavoidably strive to go on existing, not just in the sense of surviving, but in the fuller sense of living in ways that are increasingly satisfying and empowering, and developing attitudes and resources that make this possible. Moreover, since we're heavily dependent on other people and things for our survival, let alone our flourishing, our striving largely consists in attempting to empower ourselves by relating to things around us, particularly to other people, in ways that increase our ability to flourish. So what's this striving like? Spinoza argues that it manifests itself in what he calls our affects, our emotionally inflected experiences of the ways that things affect us. To put his view schematically, as he does himself, some of our interactions with the world make us joyful, while others sadden us. And on the basis of these experiences, we strive to become more joyful and avoid sadness. We try to create individual and collective ways of life that we experience as predominantly joyful or satisfying, in which we're protected against debilitating forms of sadness. At a relatively straightforward level, for example, we try to ensure that we have regular supplies of food and are able to avoid starvation. At a rather more complex one, we try to create social circles in which we can enjoy the pleasures of friendship and fend off loneliness. At the same time, we try to create circumstances in which we can find out how to experience yet greater joyfulness. We devise complex ways of life which yield many diverse forms of satisfaction and enable us to protect ourselves against many forms of sadness. Spinoza is firmly convinced that the optimal way of striving to persevere in our being is to focus on understanding ourselves and our interactions with the world. To put it in his terms, the key to a maximally empowering and joyful way of life is understanding. To make progress in this direction, we need to develop our knowledge of what we are like, what the world is like, how it operates, how we interact with it. And in order to do that, we need to develop appropriate ways of finding these things out. But that project, in turn, depends on a further condition which can't be taken for granted. We have to be capable of devoting energy to the project of extending our understanding rather than dissipating it in other directions. We must be able to commit ourselves to the ongoing task of understanding what the world is like and putting our knowledge to work in the way we live. This, Spinoza thinks, is the best way of striving to persevere in our being. Now, from that point of view, fake news is a serious problem. First, because it's false, and it's in this respect a failure of understanding, but also, and more importantly, because it embodies a weak commitment to understanding. As I noted at the beginning, propagators of fake news and their audiences seem strangely unconcerned about whether their narratives are really true. They seem to lack the commitment to pursuing understanding that Spinoza regards as vital to a securely joyful way of life. For example, rather than resisting the blandishments of superstition, the preachers and their followers cling to narratives that are not only false, but epistemologically destructive. Or to take a different case, rather than facing up to the fact that the election wasn't stolen, defenders of the view that it was seem to cling to their preferred narratives and the distorted evidence on which it's based. While Spinoza agrees that this certainly is a problem, he doesn't think that the existence of fake news should surprise us. True, the optimal way to live joyfully is to develop our understanding, but this capacity doesn't come easily and it can't be assumed. Very few of us, he claims, achieve the consistent commitment to truthful understanding that characterizes a fully rational way of life. Most of us, as we strive to persevere in our being, are far more strongly drawn to more immediate satisfactions, loving relationships, physical prowess, positions of power, which shape the way that we use our energies and distract us from the wider project of understanding. At the same time, we're often diverted from this project by the existential threat of sadness that our vulnerability to the world is almost bound to produce. Surrounded as we are by things we can't control, much of our striving focuses on alleviating our most immediate fears of the saddening things that might happen to us. It's important, Spinoza thinks, to see how this last emotional pressure undermines our ability to understand ourselves correctly. In our efforts to contain our fears, We individually and collectively adopt various compensatory strategies. One of these is to bolster our confidence by systematically overestimating the extent to which we're in control of our lives and are able to avoid getting into saddening situations. So, to adapt an example from Spinoza's magnum opus, the Ethics, a timid person who comes, say, upon a fracas in the street won't have the courage to weigh in and help the victim. But rather than acknowledging this painful truth about themselves, they may reconstruct the episode in a more flattering light. They considered intervening, but they decided not to. Their actions were the result of judicious judgment, certainly not timidity. In Spinoza's view, we're all subject to this disposition to reinterpret our experiences in ways that make us feel good about ourselves. Through shared narratives and the practices in which they're embedded, we create misleading accounts of the reach of our understanding and our power. In a second strategy, we also fend off our fears by imagining that we're better protected against the world than we are. In some cases, we invest our hopes in imagined guardians, such as angels or other friendly spirits, which don't in fact exist, Spinoza says. In other cases, we endow real objects with consoling properties that they don't in fact possess. We may become convinced that a political leader can be counted on to look after our interests, or that a doctor can definitely cure us. In both types of case, the entities we imagine can present themselves as entirely veridical. Angels may seem as real as doctors, and the expectations we invest in them may be as compelling as our expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow. So what Spinoza brings out here is that our ordinary efforts to live joyfully and avoid sadness are not consistently attuned to understanding the world accurately. On the contrary, we've got a great capacity to interpret ourselves and other things as we want them to be, without giving the truth all that much consideration. We take the world as it strikes us. Or to put the point another way, it's not unusual for our commitment to understanding to be outweighed by our investment in other forms of joyfulness, which dominate the way that we strive to persevere in our being. We can see these conclusions at work, I think, in Spinoza's account of the Calvinist preachers. The key to the preacher's success, he claims, is fear. In his words, people are tormented by superstition only so long as they're afraid. In this condition, he goes on, the things they worship are nothing but apparitions, the delusions of a sad and fearful mind. When we're afraid, we're extremely suggestible, and already Spinoza claims to believe anything whatever as long as it relieves our anxiety. The preachers exploit this state of mind. They first induce fear, for example, by threatening their audiences with eternal punishment. They then take advantage of the credulousness that fear generates by offering their own doctrines as an antidote. Just trust in what I tell you, and you won't have anything to be afraid of. So, to sum up the argument so far, Spinoza's analysis speaks to the third of the three features of fake news that I distinguished at the beginning by proposing an explanation of what makes the preacher's followers susceptible to fake news. Afflicted by fear and uncertainty, they strive to become more joyful in one of the ways that human beings do by embracing a fake narrative according to which they have no cause for fear. What drives their susceptibility to fake news is the power of their affects, in this case, fear. So that's a first claim. But Spinoza also acknowledges the second of my three features of fake news when he describes the preachers as deliberately manipulative. Motivated by greed and ambition and envy, they willfully deceive their followers. So can Spinoza also explain this aspect of the situation? If, as he tells us, everything we think and do is explicable in terms of natural causes and effects, it should be possible to explain lying and other forms of deception in these terms. But what might such an explanation look like? At first glance, I think the answer seems fairly straightforward. Like everyone else, the preachers strive to relate to the world in ways that they experience as joyful and empowering. Given their temperaments, they gain great satisfaction from their worldly status, their sense of their own authority, perhaps from their capacity to deceive others, and also from their success in a highly competitive milieu. Their strong investment in maintaining these satisfactions far outweighs their investment in promoting their own or others' understanding. Rather than acknowledging the limits of their knowledge, they invent narratives that deceive their followers. I don't think Spinoza would dissent from this interpretation. Most of the time, we strive to persevere in our being on the basis of our limited experience, both of the kinds of joy we find most satisfying and of the most effective ways of securing them. From a given perspective, a situation may present itself as one in which deceiving other people is the most joy-producing course of action available, and the untruthfulness involved seems relatively unimportant. In the moment, or perhaps more consistently, lying presents itself as the most affirming thing to do. Spinoza agrees with this, but he also suggests a less cut and dried explanation of the teacher's behavior, which returns us to the third feature of fake news, the puzzlingly slack commitment to truthfulness that it sometimes seems to involve. Up to now, we've been viewing the preachers as deliberate manipulators, but they too are human, and like their audiences, they're vulnerable to fear and other forms of sadness. Perhaps they also fear divine retribution and are striving to suppress their terror. Perhaps, rather than deliberately deceiving their audiences, they've almost lost sight of their deceitfulness and are telling it pretty much as they see it. Just as fear can make their audiences credulous, so it may do the same to them. In short, perhaps the grounds of their susceptibility to fake news are much the same as those of their followers. Whether we're socially powerful like the preachers or relatively powerless like their followers, we look for emotional satisfaction where we can get it, and often rely on epistemologically weak or destructive strategies to maintain it. Credulousness, obstinacy, closed-mindedness, things like this don't rate highly on the list of debilitating sadnesses that we struggle to resist. And in our efforts to live joyfully, we often succumb to them. As Spinoza points out, it's not just given to us to have sound or rational minds, any more than it's just given to us to have sound and healthy bodies. Now, viewed like this, fake news is one of our ordinary ways of coping with fears that are part of our existential condition. So if we're going to become less susceptible to it, something will have to change. And here again, I think Spinoza has something important to tell us. The most effective way to reduce our susceptibility to fake news, the ultimately effective way, he argues, would be to bring about an alteration in the way we strive to live joyfully. We need to become more consistently and firmly committed to the collective project of working out how to cope with debilitating fears and other kinds of sadness, thereby creating more securely satisfying ways of life. However, even if we can see the sense of this project, we can't just decide to implement it. As Spinoza reminds us, the true knowledge of good and evil, insofar as it's true, can't restrain our affects. That's to say, just understanding that this would be the optimal thing to do may not alter our emotional investments or redirect our striving at all. To strengthen our commitment to understanding, we have to feel the satisfaction of it and want to achieve it. So what's it like to be strongly and consistently committed to understanding? I want to concentrate here on one aspect of Spinoza's reply, because it will help us to come to terms with another puzzling feature of our susceptibility to fake news, the fact that people are usually only susceptible to it in certain domains. In many areas of their lives, people who propagate and cleave to fake narratives are perfectly competent inquirers. They assess evidence in the expected ways, they revise their opinions as the evidence changes, and so on. This seems to make their susceptibility to fake news more puzzling. There seems to be something about particular topics that prevents them from exercising their broad epistemological competence, so that there they don't assess the evidence in the usual way. How can we explain this? To see how Spinoza answers the question, let's focus first on what it's like to take enough satisfaction in the project of understanding to put it at the center of one's striving for joyfulness. So, to be committed to understanding is not to be committed to investigating everything in one way or subjecting everything to one standard of truth. In fact, Spinoza distinguishes two broad methods of inquiry. The more formal one, which is designed to deliver what he describes as mathematical certainty, starts from indubitable premises and proceeds by deductive steps to indubitable conclusions. In the higher reaches of philosophy, where we try to map the relations between universal truths, this is the only appropriate method to use. But it would be sheer stupidity, Spinoza observes, to demand mathematical certainty in all forms of inquiry. In areas such as history or politics, where we derive our knowledge from experience, we should assess claims and narratives for what he calls their moral certainty. We consider, that is, whether they're sufficiently probable to count as true. To make matters more complicated, appropriate standards of moral certainty vary from one area of inquiry to another. To cite some of Spinoza's examples and give you a sense of the range that he's thinking of here, we use one set of criteria for determining the truth of prophecies, another for assessing the truth of historical narratives, and yet another for assessing astronomical observations. In these circumstances, developing an emotional commitment to understanding is not just a matter of coming to enjoy the pursuit of truth. It's also a matter of getting satisfaction from understanding different kinds of things in the right ways, by relying on appropriate epistemological standards and tailoring them to the specific topics under consideration. The sheer complexity of this project explains why Spinoza regards full understanding as a rare and arguably not a fully achievable accomplishment. But part of the reason it's so hard to achieve is that the pleasurable expectations we bring to understanding and the enjoyment we derive from it are not evenly spread over all areas of inquiry. You may find maths enormously rewarding, but be ill at ease and a bit obstinate when it comes to studying religion. A community may take pride in its undoubted political acumen, but be really plodding in the appreciation of music. Living as joyfully as possible by developing our understanding is a massive and ongoing project, and we're not usually capable of making all the effective commitments on which the project as a whole depends. Individually and collectively, our commitments are always uneven. As we've already seen, we also find this uneven commitment to understanding in people who propagate and spread fake news. In many areas of inquiry, they operate normally, but in relation to certain narratives, their commitment is unusually weak. Once again, Spinoza doesn't regard this as pathological or particularly abnormal. We should see it, he urges, as a relatively extreme manifestation of our naturally variable emotional commitment to developing and sustaining different kinds of understanding. In fake news, this commitment is low. There's a palpable resistance to questioning a narrative or engaging with criticism. Why is that so? Well, once again, we can hope to explain it in Spinoza's naturalist terms. So let me now try to put these arguments together. For Spinoza, as we've seen, fake news flourishes when we're subject to powerful and distressing affects, particularly fear. The desire to alleviate these emotions dominates our striving to persevere in our being, and it marginalizes our interests in other kinds of joy. In these circumstances, we're susceptible to false narratives that offer hope, and in order to keep fear at bay, we're liable to invest in them. But Spinoza's point here is that in doing so, we pay an epistemological price. The narratives themselves blunt our sensitivity to the dangers of stubbornness and credulity and override the satisfactions of open-mindedness and criticism. Committing to them makes us more joyful by giving us grounds for hope, but it simultaneously weakens our commitments to exercising epistemological skills that are integral to the project of understanding. In some particular domain, the standards of inquiry that we would normally expect and which contribute to the overall pursuit of understanding are at an effective discount. The desire to increase our happiness by understanding ourselves better is overwhelmed by the more immediate satisfactions that the narrative yields. So, if that explains our susceptibility to fake news, what, if anything, can we do about it? Here Spinoza has a two-pronged answer, and I'll draw to a close by considering both prongs. On the one hand, he argues that we can become more resistant to fake news by cultivating what he calls the private virtue of strength of mind. On the other hand, we must look to the state and other social institutions to help us. We've seen that our susceptibility to fake narratives and the epistemological weaknesses they embody is localized. It flows from particular fears, which are alleviated by particular fake narratives. It's true, of course, that an agent may be so strongly invested in a fake narrative that the epistemological weaknesses it embodies spill over into other domains. For example, as more and more everyday beliefs and attitudes are swallowed up by accusations of conspiracy, an agent's ordinary epistemological functioning may be progressively vitiated. But it's also possible for our investments in ordinary standards of inquiry to put pressure on a fake narrative and weaken our emotional investment in it. Even as someone enjoys the sense of self-righteousness that goes with the conviction that the presidential election was stolen, they may be a little bit uneasy about the coherence of the narrative, or experience a twinge of doubt as to whether they're answering their critics fairly. In propitious circumstances, those affects may come to the fore. Someone who's so far been committed to a fake narrative may begin to question themselves, feel something akin to shame at having judged carelessly, and undergo a change of heart. Spinoza accepts that that's not always possible. It'll depend on the emotional strength of one's investment in the fake narrative and the competing strengths of other desires and satisfactions. But since the constellations of affect that make us susceptible to fake news change with our experience and are rarely entirely immune to critical reflection, then we may be capable of shifting them. Spinoza describes that process of strengthening our commitment to understanding as the cultivation of what he calls tenacity. Becoming more tenacious in this sense is a matter of getting better at monitoring how well one is managing to keep focused on the joyfulness of understanding and making adjustments where necessary. One might need to take a bit more time off, or alternatively, work a bit harder. But tenacity isn't freestanding. As Spinoza so often reminds us, we can hardly sustain our lives and cultivate our minds without mutual aid. So we won't get far with cultivating tenacity unless we do this cooperatively with other people. The strength of mind at which we're aiming depends on both those capacities. It's a matter of learning to work with other people to keep focused on the project of extending our understanding. But that brings me to the second prong of Spinoza's discussion. To deal with fake news, it's not enough to cooperate on a small scale. We must cast our net as widely as possible and devise political remedies for it. What sort of remedies does Spinoza have in mind? The task of a state, he argues, is to create conditions in which everyone can be confident of living peacefully and securely, so that the fears that feed into fake news are kept manageably remote. One of the tools that states use to protect us is, of course, the law. The state is best, Spinoza says, when laws are equitable and equitably administered, and the law is kept without violation. A polity where you're afraid that the law won't protect you and where it's continually being broken is really not much better than a state of nature, and it's almost as frightening. It's just the kind of regime where fake news will flourish. But peace and security also presuppose a certain kind of political culture. If we're to be confident that our lives are reasonably and predictably safe, we need to be able to trust the authorities who govern us. We must be able to believe that they have our welfare at heart and are capable of promoting it. To put the point as Spinoza does, we must be able to view our rulers with a certain degree of respect. If they openly disdain the law, he says, our confidence in them will be undermined. And in this situation, both rulers and ruled will be exposed to the kinds of fears that make us susceptible to fake news. Those in power will be afraid of losing it. And like the Calvinist preachers, they may resort to fake narratives to maintain their position. Their subjects will fear a way of life in which incompetent government and ill-conceived laws increase their vulnerability. Like the preacher's followers, they may find solace in fake news. Let me conclude with the moral Spinoza draws, which is that the state and other forms of social organization must recognize and act on the recognition that they're responsible for the epistemic virtues and vices of their citizens. If a particular community is stubborn, Spinoza says, this is to be imputed to the state. As we've seen, epistemic weaknesses such as stubbornness and credulity are often embedded in social practices that are in turn responses to fear. And in Spinoza's view, it's the task of the state to minimize the fears from which they spring. Where states are successful, the pursuit of understanding is more likely to take center stage. Protected from extreme anxiety, people will have more emotional space to relish it, and our ability to develop securely joyful ways of life will be stronger. But where people are afraid of losing their jobs to robots, having inadequate access to healthcare, being unable to provide for themselves or their children, being vulnerable to fire and flood, in short, where they are incompetently governed, then we should expect fake news to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor James has kindly agreed to answer questions for a little while, and there is a roving mic, so please do. And there are already many. There's someone just there.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you a specific question about fake news and perhaps controversially, the positive role that Spinoza may attribute to something adjacent to it, especially in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in particular of the notorious Dogmata Fide Universalis, the doctrines of universal faith,
Yes.
which according to at least several contemporary interpreters, would pass several of the criteria that you offered for them being fake news, them being, in some sense, deliberately untruthful, perhaps to some extent being offered to preserve social stability rather than cultivate something in itself virtuous.
Yes.
So I suppose I just wanted you to comment, if possible, on this almost inconsistency on Spinoza's part, or if not this inconsistency, then at least this elitist view that he has towards the capacity for collective knowledge and the limitations that this imposes for an escape from fake news.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's a marvelous question. And really, you know, there's room for another lecture while we explore this theme. But I think what I want to say is that Spinoza is, just as you say, very alert to the way that narratives that are in some ways false, or in some ways misleading, shall we say, at least misleading, and can nevertheless play a very productive role in society. And his case is the notion of religion, where, as it were, holding beliefs about God or about, you know, what happened in the history of the Bible can be productive to keeping life comfortable and also enhancing our understanding. So I think it's that last bit which is so important. The contrast, I think, between the kind of fake news that I've been talking about today, like Spinoza's critique of superstition, and the idea that certain doctrines and narratives can be productive in helping people to live cooperatively, has to do partly with the way that they do or don't damage people's epistemological capacities. I think the thing about superstition, and Spinoza makes this very clear in the preface to the TTP, which was what I was discussing, that superstition, as well, undermines our epistemological capacities. It damages our ability to make progress towards greater understanding. There can be other narratives, misleading, not strictly true, fanciful, or whatever, which don't have that effect, which, as it were, bolster our confidence in our capacities to think critically about ourselves and our situation. And they act as a sort of staging post on the way to the sort of philosophical understanding that I think for Spinoza is the highest form of religion or the ultimate aspiration for us human beings.
I think just behind you.
Thank you. I wonder if Spinoza's got something to say, like people who are really invested in their conspiracy views or something like that. Is there, I mean, whatever you say to them, they'll dig deeper into them. Is there anything we can do to sort of undig them?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily, I don't think Spinoza thinks. I mean, so his view, as I've been sort of trying to sketch, is that our striving to live joyfully is fixed on, as well, whatever we can understand and really emotionally grasp as things that will make our lives more comfortable, secure, and satisfying in a range of ways. And so if people are, as it were, sort of so rigidly fixed on one particular narrative which is serving this function for them, then, you know, there may not be much we can do about it. But there are a lot of things that we could try, even though we can't necessarily count on succeeding, because, you know, people are very susceptible to their environment, according to Spinoza. They're always being affected by different things. And so, for example, a different range of possibilities, conversation partners, or indeed, following out my line of argument, as it were, addressing the fears that this conspiracy theory is speaking to, could possibly make it better. Yes.
Oh, got my question now.
Okay.
We were talking about fake news, and Spinoza has a curious view on truth. In some sense, fake news are partial information, or information that we don't have the complete view of what's happening in them. In what sense is Spinoza's idea of truth and adequate ideas instead of partial knowledge relevant to understanding what fake news are and how fast they spread?
Yeah, good. Well, it's true, isn't it, that Spinoza has a very ambitious sense of the way that we might be capable of understanding nature, including ourselves, in terms of what he calls adequate ideas. And these would be the kind of ideas that we can be 100% confident in because of the way we've derived them, and from which we can derive other consequences in which we can be 100% confident. But I think that the kind of, the areas of his work that I'm talking about all fall within the realm of what he calls imagination. We're always dealing with ideas that are, as it were, better or worse substantiated, where our evidence for them is stronger or weaker. And so when I talk about, as it were, pursuing truth in this way, fake news is distinguished from what we take to be truth because it falls way below a sort of normal set of standards that we're operating with. But those standards may in turn fall short of the realm of adequate ideas that Spinoza envisages for us. In fact, they probably usually do. I mean, we're talking about life in society.
Other questions? Remembered question there, great.
Yes. What you described seems to be pretty much like this humanism, basically. With that in mind, what agency do humanists have to actually influence the world as it is today? Because we have so many disasters. What would you recommend for a humanist to do with the state of this world?
Well, small question. I'm going to continue to speak in Spinoza's voice here, and remind you that Spinoza thinks that probably our best way forward here is a democratic way forward. And for him, after all, he's, as it were, sort of looking forward to the generation of what we would consider democratic societies. What he means by a democracy is just a relatively inclusive society where people can devise institutional means of, as it were, trying to keep themselves guided towards this project of understanding. So keeping free speech as open as possible, keeping democratic assemblies as deliberative as possible, things like that. So I think that would be his kind of answer. We obviously look at this problem from a very different perspective, very much confronted by the difficulties of this kind of democratic society and sometimes its failures. So I think that, as I said to you, this view won't give us precise policy directions. It won't say, okay, so go out and do this. But it does orient us towards the view that some of the most, as it were, uncaring and damaging aspects of our society have this effect of feeding into fake news. And that's what we should expect.
Yep, Claire.
I just want to ask you a question about joy, actually.
Yeah.
Does Spinoza think that we always and only humans have the capacity to produce joy and joyfulness from our collective, our better understanding and what we're trying to do together? So I'm thinking as you're speaking, and I found it such a fascinating talk, that is joy, does he also address the fact that joy often arises, or joyfulness, in the most unexpected of circumstances, not under our control at all, but out of situations that we cannot quite ever imagine that it might happen in? And I wonder if he says anything about that.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Not sort of directly quite in that shape. But on the other hand, it is very important to Spinoza that the kinds of things that produce joyfulness in us, the kinds of interactions that make us feel in one way or another good about the world, energized about the world, empowered, those kind of range of things, are not very predictable, and they're not very much under our control. So the sort of line of argument that I've been talking about, where you can sort of see that the project is to try to sort of get this a bit more under our control in certain ways, is, as he sees it, very volatile. And it's not that we have no idea how to do it. It's just that we don't have a very good idea how to do it. We can't sort of produce a map and say, let's do it like this. It's a matter of experiment. And also the solutions, as it were, that will be helpful to us very much depend upon the kinds of communities that we are. Different groups of people, he says, have different temperaments, they have different histories, they're susceptible to the world in different ways. So it's also a sort of historical and sociological experiment to find out how to live joyfully.
Where's the microphone? Yeah, just here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Ursula.
Hi.
Hi.
I wonder if you could, so it strikes me that some fake news narratives present the world as being more threatening and scary than in fact it is. And I just wondered how that would fit with Spinoza's explanation. So I'm thinking two sorts of things. So one is a very common kind of fake news narrative presents some minority group as very threatening in certain various different ways, right?
Yes.
And so makes it seem more scary than it, let's say it's a fake news narrative, than it in fact is.
I'm also thinking the last time I was in the States, my taxi driver came out with an awful lot of stuff that I think was what you would call fake news, but it included that we were on the brink of nuclear war. So it's hard to see that as a way of accepting a story that will quell your fears. So I'm just wondering about those kinds of fake news narratives and what Spinoza might say about
Yes. And I mean, I think that's a terribly important point, and it's also a feature really of the sometimes of the Calvinist preachers, because they tell you some pretty scary things before they can console you, as it were. So that might be part of the answer, that get people really scared and then, as it were, get them susceptible to fake news, and the scary things form part of the scariness. I think that there is something else here which I don't know what you think. I mean, this is just anecdotal, as it were, but it seems that, as it were, sometimes there is something tremendously comforting and satisfying about seeing yourselves as the kind of people who understand the world how it really is, even if that's pretty bad. That it does give you a certain kind of power to be able to say to everybody else, well, you have no idea. and so the kind of dynamic that I've been talking about today is extremely simplified, even in relation to Spinoza's account, but also into anything we would need to say. Yeah, I feel, thank you, that's really good.
I think last question just there. Great.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Christina. I'm a fellow with the Reuters Journalism Institute, and I was wondering if you could speak to the role of journalism and news in this context, since you spoke of both the two solutions being this personal tenacity, and then also relying on the state and in a way of like creating a better sense of trust and safety. And so what is the role of news when that job is to both foster understanding, but often to increase a sense of fear in a way that is not so much promoting a place that fake news can be spread more easily, but is also creating a more stable environment, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
It feels like the role of news right now is in conflict, both because it increases fear and is meant to increase understanding.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, I think this is partly, so first thing to say is that in the talk, I simply discussed the state as though this was, some big monolithic entity, and clearly it's not, and clearly Spinoza thinks, as we do, that there are many other social and political institutions which are crucial in this whole project. Then the picture gets really messy. I think that you're talking not about the ways in which the press and the media generally, as well, exacerbate fake news, but about the way it's part of the media's job to, as it would, keep us informed about things that are really frightening. Is that right? Yeah, exactly. So then I think that, as it was, Spinoza's take on that sort of point is, I mean, it's really important, because he's not saying, the state will create this sort of Panglossian world for you where that would be as bad as superstition, more or less. So I think that the question is how you can keep people informed about the fact that life is very dangerous, very uncomfortable in lots of ways, but at the same time make it possible for them to manage it. And what fake news narratives like the preachers do is manifestly fail to do that. Do you see what I mean? So that would be the first point, only, I guess, step one in a longer argument about what the role of a good journalist or good media would be. Yeah.
Okay. I need to
Thank you very
release
much.
you to have a drink. So I'm going to say a couple of things before I thank Sue. The first is everyone is warmly invited to the reception afterwards, which is in the Warrington rooms. If you go out of here and make your way down the corridor, you'll find it. And I think there's plenty of home team to show you as well. Secondly, a little advance notice of the 2024 Upton Lecture, which, as you will have worked out, is a Martha lecture and therefore on religion. And Edmund Duval, a potter and writer, will be giving that. And he's working on the Psalms at the moment, so he's going to talk about the Psalms, and I believe he's also making some pots about the Psalms, or at least inspired by the Psalms. So I hope you'll all come in probably April or May, which is when we'll have that. But thank you very much, Sue. You did perfectly what we wanted in this lecture, which was to give us this fantastically rich and textured lecture about Spinoza, but help us think about a very pressing, sharp issue in our own time. And you did it with enormous aplomb and humour and brilliance, as always. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.